How many of you have played that telephone game? When you tell someone a sentence at the beginning of the line, and then you send it down through the rest of the line, and when it gets to the end, you hear what the person heard. And often, it's really difficult to have any sense that there's a relationship between how it ended up and how it began. So Francis of Assisi died on the evening of October 3rd in 1226, 797 years ago. Immediately following his death, there were accounts of his life written with a little bit of embellishment, as the intention was to set the stage for him to be canonized a saint, which they did less than 2 years after he died. There's thousands of books written, thousands of sermons given, thousands of stories about his life. Don't you sometimes wonder how we're doing with the accuracy of the origin? If we can end up with a great distortion of one simple phrase in one sitting, imagine 797 years and millions of people seeking to pass a whole life story down the line. Heck, I sometimes wonder if the way I tell the story about my own life is really how it was. Many of us are inspired by Francis of Assisi, but what do we really know about Francis, the human being, and his lifetime of words, dreams, deeds, thoughts? There are the familiar stories that get passed down on over the centuries that tell us, one of them is that he was a peacemaker, that he would be called upon to mediate conflict between people who were fighting, sometimes between the bishops and the mayors, which we don't ever have today, do we? He'd be called in to try to mediate the conversation. Another story is that during the Fifth Crusade, he risked his life to cross the battlefield to have a conversation with the Sultan. He wanted to share his Christian faith with the Muslim Sultan. And the Sultan was so moved by the sincerity and the deep faith of Francis that he arranged that Francis would then be escorted back home safely. The end of the war was not achieved at that moment, but both men were transformed, and they parted with a deep respect for each other's faith. It was this encounter, this desire for peace between neighbors, between nations, that still to this day inspires the Franciscans to take a lead in the Christian-Muslim dialogue. In pictures about St. Francis, we often see him sitting with animals or speaking with birds, surrounded by the trees and the plants. He is named the patron saint of ecology. He did not believe that humans were to have dominion over all the earth, and that all of us are one, all creatures, all people, brother sun, sister moon, sister water, and we must acknowledge and care for the earth. One of the most famous stories of Francis as a peacemaker and a brother with creatures is when he went out to meet with a wolf in the town of Gubbio. This wolf was frightening the townspeople. He was roaming around, attacking people, attacking animals. And so when Francis came into the town, people began to tell him about this fear-inducing wolf. So fearless and with compassion, Francis went out to meet with the wolf in his cave. He didn't set out to reprimand him or blame him or judge him or push him out of sight. He set out to meet him with a genuine desire to connect. Francis understood that ferociousness comes, for all of us, when one is hungry and tired and treated as an outcast. He asked Brother Wolf if he would cease his frightening ways, if the townspeople would come together to make sure he had a welcoming space and to have food so that he no longer had to suffer hunger. The wolf agreed. And the story is told that Francis then extended his hand, and the wolf in turn raised his forepaw and placed it in Francis's hand. It's a sign that it's a mutual commitment. Now, are all these stories true? Did they happen as they have been passed down to us? Does it really matter? What we do know is that Francis of Assisi lived in such a way that he left a lasting impression on the earth, such that here we are, 797 years after his death, telling stories of his life that have inspired and challenged millions of people, including me. At the Fool's Court in the Tenderloin, we have a wooden statue of Siddhartha the Buddha and St. Francis. Kay and I acquired them soon after we moved into the Fool's Court, and they stood outside our bedrooms. And in the evenings, when we bid one another a good night, a bit like the Waltons, we'd say, "Good night, Kay. Good night, Carmen. Good night, Sid. Good night, Frank." For St. Francis was Francis, a human being with a human heart that was infused by faith and perseverance and maybe a little craziness. They are necessary traits when one needs to keep on moving, when their way of being is met with doubt and misunderstanding. The loyalty is to the drumbeat of one's heart, even if we ourselves don't know where we are going, except maybe for Francis toward God, toward love. Francis was saintly to some and a nuisance to others. He was a fool, more comfortable on the streets with the marginalized of our world than in a fortified edifice or an office. For him, he said, "The world is my cloister." It is true, we do not all have the same call as Francis, but the mandate that rings in my ears comes from one of my own Franciscan sisters when we were living in Nicaragua. We were reading material sent to us that was saying, "To be Franciscan means this, and to be Franciscan means that." And Joanne threw up her arms and said with exasperation, "Francis lived with compassion. So to be Franciscan means to live with passion." So may it be so for all of us. Amen, sister.